I'm Celine. I study sociology at the University in Frankfurt.
And my name is Matylda. I study American Studies at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow.
And today we're gonna talk about transness and labor under the Nazi regime. So our talk is going to be based on a paper written by Xavier Nunn called Transliminality and the Nazi State, where Nunn talks about trans women called R, which we're going to introduce to you later. Why are we doing this, Matylda?
We are creating this podcast as part of the Persecution of Queer People under National Socialism Summer School, which is organized by Deutsche Gesellschaft EV and GFPS-Polska.
Since we are talking about sexual and gender identities in this podcast, we would like to give a little disclosure on the taxonomies that we are using. Since we are talking about people that lived in the past, most of the terms that we use today, like queer, lesbian, homosexual, or non-binary and trans, were not used at that time. But still, their habits and what we know about them point into a direction that they were probably what we would call today queer. So if we use these terms, keep in mind that the people that we are talking about probably didn't use that categories for themselves. It even gets more complicated because the material that we are relying on to talk about their identity mostly comes from institutions like the police or the Gestapo, where those individuals were policed. They were produced in an environment that was forceful and oftentimes harmful.
We have another very short disclaimer. So essentially, one of the other words that we are going to be using here is going to be the word Aryan. Now, you should know that the word Aryan is kind of a fake category that was explicitly created by Nazis. And our usage of this word is more so for the sake of historical accuracy than any endorsement of this category as an idea. And if we were to translate what the Nazis thought of as quote-unquote Aryans, in today's terms, we would probably say ethnic Germans. So this is what we mean when we say this. And keep in mind that the word Aryan is something that is very specifically tied to Nazi ideology. So what was the situation of queer people under National Socialism?
So actually, long before the Nazis took over, gay men were persecuted under paragraph 175, which made all sexual relationships between men illegal. And that paragraph was in place from 1872 to 1935. But after a relatively liberal phase in the Weimar Republic, the Nazis made it more strict. So I would say the situation changed drastically for queer people during the Nazi regime.
It's also interesting that other people that we would consider queer today were not directly persecuted by the law. For example, lesbian sexual relationships were not legal. However, a lot of the time, other queer people, such as trans people, lesbians, intersex people, were persecuted under other less relevant legislation. So, for example, paragraph 183 criminalized publicly visible nudity and so-called exhibitionism, as well as sexual acts committed in public. So this was public indecency. The person we are using as an example today was a transgender woman. And the Nazis could not prove that she was a homosexual man, even though they, of course, misgendered her and considered her male, but they could not prove homosexuality. For that reason, they couldn't prosecute her under 175, but they could do it under 183, public indecency, which is how she ended up in jail. So, as you can tell from this example, being trans or gender nonconforming by itself was not illegal. It was not a punishable offense. So, Celine, what was the Nazis' perception of trans people then?
Nazis' perception of trans people was actually heavily influenced by Magnus Hirschfeld, who was a sexologist who was really active during the Weimar Republic, doing research on sexuality and gender identity. He flew the country when the Nazi took over, but still the Nazis took some of his ideas and research. And one of that was the transvestite certificates that he started to issue for people that dressed with the clothes of another gender. They issued those certificates so that those people were known to the police and that the police would not arrest them because of homosexuality, public indecency, or prostitution. It was a way to deal with them, but it was far away from accepting them.
So the Nazis actually had this idea called the Volksgemeinschaft, even though they didn't come up with it. This is an idea that dates back to World War I, actually, and Volksgemeinschaft itself means like people's community. And the idea was that Germans were supposed to be united by their nationality. This was, again, during wartime. They were supposed to be united by their nationality and not divided by other reasons that people could feel different from others, like, for example, different class, different social class. So even though the Nazis didn't come up with it, they used this concept in order to create national unity between all Germans and, again, sort of mitigate other divisions that were happening in German society. But what the Nazis added to this idea was that the Volksgemeinschaft was supposed to be a sort of utopian, ethnically homogenous society. It was really divided along racial lines. So anybody who wasn't quote-unquote Aryan would be immediately excluded from the so-called Volksgemeinschaft. They could not be part of this society. Now, the problem is that if you were transgender, like R, but you were also quote-unquote Aryan, that meant that you couldn't necessarily be immediately excluded from the so-called Volksgemeinschaft. This was supposed to be a utopian society, a very sort of calm one where people just worked together and lived together. So trans people presented a little bit of a problem from the perspective of the Nazis. On the one hand, if they were Aryan, then they could not be, again, immediately excluded. On the other hand, if they were not homosexual men, they could not be immediately cast out based on 175, but also a lot of the time their gender nonconformity was seen as a mental illness, a burden to society, or a public nuisance.
Like Matylda already said, since there wasn't a specific paragraph that made trans people illegal or acting trans illegal, the police heavily relied on the denunciation from the people or like the neighbors to point out people that were not conforming to the Volksgemeinschaft concept. So denunciations played a crucial role in the persecution of queer people in the NS state. It was mostly neighbors, even family members that denunciated their close friends. There are also like scholars that call those denunciations like an additional branch of the Gestapo.
So R, our protagonist for today, even though she was issued a so-called transvestite certificate, she was not considered a woman in the eyes of the law. She was actually sort of considered like a third gender or someone who doesn't really conform to gender. This was under the Weimar Republic. For that reason, she was able to marry a woman. Her name was Gertrude. And a very sad part of R's story is actually that in 1937 she was interned at the Sachsenhausen concentration camp for a year. Even though we don't have any evidence to prove this to be true or not true, R personally believed that it was actually her wife who denounced her to the Gestapo and caused her to be sent to the concentration camp. Essentially, her wife told the Gestapo that she was unaware of the fact that R was trans, which is provably untrue, and it was on this basis, this alleged deceit that R committed, that the Gestapo decided to put her in a concentration camp, because otherwise they couldn't really do anything about her being transgender besides sort of forcing her to detransition and taking away her certificate, which they already did before. So as you can see from R's example, denunciation was often the thing that was actually necessary to even persecute a transgender person in the absence of a law stating that what they were doing was illegal. Now, none actually states that this was especially common in queer communities, and he speculates that the reason that Gertrude might have denounced R was essentially to save herself, to give herself an excuse to divorce R when their marriage was already failing, and to not be seen as an adulterer. So, especially in vulnerable communities like queer communities under the Nazi regime, the sad part is that solidarity was often broken down and queer people would denounce other queer people to the Gestapo as a way of essentially protecting themselves. So as we can see in the case of R, she and other trans people were highly policed by the Nazi state, but were not killed right away. Why was that, Celine?
Yeah, what we can see really nicely with R's case is that there were several categories that went into the consideration, like in the way when Nazis tried to assess which place these individuals had in the society. So the first important thing was race, under which Sinti and Roma and Jews were persecuted by the Nazis. But then the persecution also existed in the context of gender, sexual, racial, and utilitarian categories. So people that were considered quote-unquote Aryan weren't denied their right to live right away. They had to go through other processes that the Nazis thought of.
This is visible in the way that R was treated by the Nazis following her incarceration at Sachsenhausen and then at just regular prisons. Essentially, the Nazis decided to refer her to psychiatric treatment to, in their view, cure her transness. And she was sent to the Berlin-Wittenau Medical Center in order to undergo treatment. So this really shows the centrality of race to R's story. Even though she was gender non-conforming, because she was Aryan, she had privileges that, for example, if she had been a Jewish gender non-conforming person, she would not have received. And something that really showcases that is that when R was tried, her attorney tried to distance her from Magnus Hirschfeld, who we already talked about. Hirschfeld was Jewish, and essentially the Nazis and even Nazi lawyers that were defending R were trying to portray her gender nonconformity as the result of some type of meddling by Hirschfeld, who was already considered an enemy of the state because of his Jewish heritage. So this shows that in the case of quote-unquote Aryan individuals who were nonetheless in some ways not really compatible with the Nazi concept of a social utopia, a lot of the time the excuse that was made for them was essentially that they were somehow manipulated by Jews or other quote-unquote enemies of the state. And in that situation, the way to save them from further persecution was to essentially distance them from that influence.
But what we can also see with R and the value that the Nazis placed on her labor as a draftswoman is that labor was a central value in the Nazi ideology along with the race category. What we see in the concentration camps is basically that all enemies that were incarcerated there were in some way not able to work, or like in the ideology of the Nazis, not able to work. So they were separated from the quote-unquote good German workers. And we can also see that in the ideology when Jews were seen as exploiting the labor of the Germans, Poles were thought of as cheap and uneducated labor.
So Nunn makes the argument that it was because of R's training as a draftsperson, which essentially means that she created blueprints for different buildings, which was obviously very, very necessary, that the value of her work is partially what saved her life. And this is especially important considering that the persecution against her really started to ramp up during the war. And a lot of the time we can see that the Nazis had a specific idea of how things should be done according to their ideology. They had an idea of how a quote-unquote perfect situation would look like if they could implement it. But as the war went on, and as things started to get worse for Germany, it became more and more common for the Nazis to sort of break the ideological rules that they set up in order to make sure that they had enough skilled labor and enough resources to continue the war. Now, there are multiple reasons to believe that R was considered especially valuable and was meant to be kept alive and reintegrated into society because of her skills and her ability to use those skills to help the German war effort. But one of the main ones is that, unfortunately, while she was receiving so-called treatment at Berlin-Wittenau, she ended up dying. Her death happened under somewhat mysterious circumstances, but it is very likely that she took her own life or that it was some kind of accident. The way in which she died, the way in which she likely took her own life, was analyzed by the criminal police, the Kripo, who essentially decided to characterize her as a deviant based on the way that she was found dead. So as we can see in R's case, after she died, she was no longer useful to the Nazis because, of course, since she was dead, she couldn't work. And this is likely what caused the Kripo to actually characterize her as a deviant and not someone who needed help, which is what they saw her as previously, which once again highlights the central value of labor to the way that gender nonconforming people were treated and how their quote-unquote usefulness to the regime was one of the most important factors based on which they were assessed. As R's example shows us, the persecution of trans people and other people that we would consider queer today differed from the way that gay men were treated. While there was a law provision that made male homosexuality illegal, there was no specific paragraph in the criminal code criminalizing transness or other forms of queer activity, such as, for example, lesbian love. But, of course, trans people were still far from being accepted, and instead the persecution that they faced from the National Socialist government was heterogeneous, incoherent, highly dependent on other factors that affected the Nazis' assessment of them, such as their ability to work and their so-called racial identity. And it was also inconsistent over time, dependent, for example, on what was needed for the war effort.
The persecution of lesbian and trans persons under National Socialism was really heterogeneous, and this is why there's often a notion of risk evoked, which means that since they were not conforming to the quote-unquote Volksgemeinschaft, they risked to be denunciated and persecuted, while ironically also being spared the worst of the violence. So as we can see with R, she could profit from her social capital, and others, for example, survive in marriage with other homosexuals or quote-unquote Aryan people. So what I really like about this notion of risk is that it gives us a way to acknowledge the qualitative differences between the persecution of gay men and other queer identities under National Socialism, without dismissing the hardships lesbian and trans people faced during this phase, even if there wasn't a specific paragraph that made their life illegal.
So in this podcast series, there is actually another episode that also refers to R, and this is going to be the podcast about Keita Rogali. So if you are interested in that, you are welcome to take a look at that, and thank you so much for listening.
Bye!
This podcast episode was recorded as part of the summer school Remembrance Podcasts, Persecution of Queer People under National Socialism, organized by Deutsche Gesellschaft e.V. and GFPS-Polska. The project is funded by the EVZ Foundation and the Federal Foreign Office as part of the program Young People Remember.